Hey everyone, welcome to a special edition of the Good E-Reader Radio Show. My name is Michael and I'm joined today by Mercy Pilkington, fresh out of New York, who went to the Digital Book World Conference. Mercy, how are you?
Doing great. How are you?
Not too bad. So, first of all, for people who haven't heard of Digital Book World before, what was it all about?
Okay, this was the fifth staging of the annual Digital Book World Conference and Expo. In recent years, it has come really great. It's come right off the holiday season, so it was really a good way to start the year fresh in publishing industry news. It used to be followed up right afterward in February with the O'Reilly Media Tools of Change Conference, and O'Reilly Media actually was present at this year's DBW because they're not going to be hosting Tools of Change anymore. So right off the bat, Tim O'Reilly, the CEO, founder, said, we've done our task. Our task was to bring publishers on board with digital and make them see the reason for it. We've done that, and we're ready to move on and turn that focus into something new. So Digital Book World has really stepped up and kind of become the premier, wintertime focus for publishing, but it's one of the few North American conferences that focuses strictly on digital publishing. And so every year there's a lot of great speakers. I think this year there were 240 different speakers, a lot of industry news coming out. It's always a great launching pad for studies and data, but really interesting data, not the dry kind, So
Yeah.
lots of great news comes out of Digital Book World every year.
So it's a conference that specializes in, anybody who's involved in digital publishing, enhanced ebooks, kids ebooks. They're all represented there, and there's a lot of sessions. What were the themes this year? Because I was at CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, and I mean, like 12,000 booths, about 175,000 people were there. There was two themes, curved TVs and wearable tech, so smartphone, smartwatches and things like that. Usually with these conferences, there's a theme. Well, did you notice any type of particular theme this year at DBW?
One of the things I see at DBW is less a major organized theme and more like these buzzwords. That the one topic everybody's talking about. And last year, I remember DBW was actually where the term hybrid author or hybrid publisher was introduced. Hugh Howey and his agent Kristen Nelson, took the stage. It was a standing room only event. As they're talking about what it means to be traditionally published and self-published, and we're still using that term to this day. This year, it really felt like that some of the buzzwords were marketing discovery. So that's a huge focus now. And of course, knowing that DBW is a little more slanted towards the traditional industry than, say, the self-published or indie press industry, even traditional publishers are struggling under the glut of ebooks out there. And so marketing and discovery were huge, but really everybody was talking about subscription-based reading. There was a lot of discussion of direct to consumer, and we can talk about that in a second. But again, a lot of standing room only presentations and panels on subscription reading. Of course, now that Oyster and Scribd have both launched really viable models and have gotten a lot of titles and a lot of publishers on board, where the first time Good E-Reader covered subscription reading was back in 2010
Yeah.
when we interviewed Justo Hidalgo from 24 Symbols out of Spain. That was actually the first time we covered subscription reading and this Netflix all-you-can-eat kind of thing. And it's taken this long for it really to become a viable model. And even there, we saw just as many panels saying, folks, it's not going to work, and talk about why. So there were a lot of buzzwords coming out of this year's event, focusing on those three topics.
Okay, so you've heard a lot of people talk about ebook subscription services.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously, aside from the conferences, you were interviewing many prominent figures in the publishing world. What is your take on ebook subscription sites as they stand right now? Is it a viable model? Is it something that, as a young startup looking for my first project, is an ebook subscription site something I should be doing? What's your impressions of ebook subscription sites as they stand right now?
Well, first of all, if you're a startup and you're thinking you're going to be a subscription model, I would tell you to run for the hills.
Yep.
First of all, because we've got two companies that it looks like everybody's throwing their support to. Smashwords has signed agreements with both Oyster and Scribd. major publishers are signing with both of those. So basically, it's like waking up one day and saying, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start up a company that does online streaming of movies. Why would you do that? Why would you compete with Netflix and Hulu and things like that? So yeah, this is not the time to be an ebook subscription startup
Uh,
unless you are completely different. But the thing is, all this time, what has really taken the industry this long to actually adopt ebook subscriptions is we cannot get the numbers right. How do the publishers and the authors get paid? And we saw an article this week, the National Library of Norway basically said, you know what, we can't figure it out either. Forget it. We're just going to pay. We're just going to pay the authors per page, publishers, rights holders, whomever. And so that's basically just a national project funded by the government of Norway. We don't have that option here in the US and in North America. And so basically, what we saw was a lot of people promoting ebook subscriptions. We are finding more and more publishers who are coming on board with it. They're still being cautious. They're putting out their backlist and their midlist. Maybe, one or two best-selling titles just to keep the interest going. But we're not really seeing publishers jump on board and say, yes, we think this will work. In fact, unfortunately, the opposite happened. We had two prominent figures. We had Dominique Rocca, the amazing Dynamo founder and publisher at Sourcebooks. And then we had Tim O'Reilly of O'Reilly Media. Both of them sat down with me and talked to me about ebook subscriptions and said, what's holding things back? Now, if you look at Tim O'Reilly, he owns Safari Books, which is a subscription. And all along, he has said the math is just not there. We don't have the support of the publishers because we have not been able to convince them how they're going to get paid. One thing he did tell me is that, at least this is true for Safari Books, is that the average subscription for his company, his platform, if someone reads one book that month, their entire subscription price goes to that publisher. So let's say I pay $9.99 a month. I read one book. The entire revenue, minus the portion that the platform takes, goes to the publisher. If I read 100 books, they're all going to share 1%. Again, that's not a viable model. You
no,
cannot tell a publisher they're going to get 1% of $9.99 because I read their book.
it's
At the
almost
same
like you know, I guess the way that video and music works is a lot of it is like licensing fees. So Netflix may pay, CBS, or they may pay like Fox, or like News Corp. They may pay them like $150 million for like 10 movies like a year or something like that, and they won't get any money from like the residuals. They'll just
right,
basically pay licensing fees. It almost seems like you would need to pay licensing fees to the publisher. So instead of paying on a book by book basis, or I know
right,
some subscription services are like, if you read 25 pages, this many cents a
yeah,
page goes to the publisher. It's just so convoluted. If
right.
say I had a Netflix for e-textbooks, I'd go to McGraw-Hill and be like, give me your entire library. I'll give you $250,000 for like 6 months of unlimited use. And I'm
hmm
sure that they would do it because that would be revenue that they wouldn't be able to have otherwise. And it would make sense that for them to give me their entire front list catalog, because I'm giving them like a licensing fee, basically. I don't understand why ebook subscription sites don't borrow a page from like Spotify does things differently, and all these services do things differently. There really isn't like a universal standard on how to do business on a subscription site, which is why most of them end up never working, or
Right.
get so unprofitable that they're just, unless they're getting venture capital on a regular basis, they're going to go out of business immediately because their business model is not sustainable.
Right.
I would say that a lot of subscription sites were looking at their early infancy, and a lot of people send me emails saying, I love Netflix for videos. What should I do for ebooks? And I'm like, don't do anything, because it's not
Right.
worth it. Because a
Well, the
lot.
problem is we're looking at a comparison that's not genuine. Who sits in their recliner and sees a trailer on TV for the hot new action movie of the summer and goes, man, I can't wait till that thing comes to Netflix?
I know.
They don't. They go out and they buy it and they watch it in the movie theater. They consume it at full price. The movie studio makes its money, the advertisers, the actors, everyone gets paid, and then it comes to Netflix. We don't have that kind of fire in ebooks. You will have people, we saw them before, the people who lined up at midnight when the bookstores opened to get the new Harry Potter book or the new Catching Fire, Hunger Games trilogy.
Yeah,
That does happen. Those are rare. And
it's
those are
true.
those are big events. Nobody's sitting there going, "Man, I can't wait till the 17th. That book's coming out." That's
Hey,
not how
I'm like
books
that
work.
sometimes. I'm like, I can't wait to go to the bookstores on Tuesdays because it's new book day, you know?
Right. But, again, if that were true of all books, then this might be a sustainable model, where we compare it to Netflix. Books and movies are not the same, and consumers take them differently. And so even the music industry, we consume books differently than we do music and movies. And so we keep comparing it to this Netflix model. It's not the same thing. Now, one thing Tim O'Reilly did point out in favor of ebook subscriptions. He said the traffic they've seen from subscriptions in terms of how many books that consumers actually consume through their subscription is fairly equal to if they had bought the book. We don't have that many people subscribing for $9 and reading 100 books a month. Those people are just not doing it. And so they are able to come up with the numbers that show that the typical subscription is fairly similar. It correlates in some way to as if the person had bought the book. So if they can prove that data and show that to publishers, we will get more publishers on board. Unfortunately, Dominique Rocca from Sourcebooks, somebody I adore. I'm absolutely her fangirl because she's just so innovative and so on the cusp of new things. She made a different point. With ebook lending from libraries coming along, why would I pay? Why would I subscribe for $9 a month, $9.99, to read somebody's backlist titles when I can get it for free from my library? And even if I have to wait a little bit, one thing that's been proven with library lending is if I'm on the waiting list to check out the ebook, I'm just going to go buy it. I'm going to go, forget this. I'm 14th in line. I'll just go get it because it's only $7.99 on Amazon. And so she's shown that publishers actually benefit from ebook lending in libraries because the patrons are more likely to buy it, either because they didn't want to wait or because they started it and didn't get to finish it, and then the book disappears automatically. And so they just go buy it to finish it, or they loved it so much they're ready to get that sequel like you were the day the book comes out. So they've got the solid data through the project with Overdrive and Sourcebooks to demonstrate that ebook lending really helps publishers. Where subscriptions, it's still kind of up in the air. And so why do it?
So libraries have come a long way. I
Mm-hmm.
remember not even about a year and a half ago, there was only one or two major publishers involved in distributing their books through libraries, such as Overdrive, 3M, Baker and Taylor, Access 360. Fast forward to today, Simon and Schuster just announced a broader rollout of all their frontlist titles to be distributed through libraries. So it seems as though every major publisher now is contributing most of their mid-list, backlist, but also most of them are doing front-list titles now
Right.
through the library. So it's a great time for libraries because it's after a lot of hard work of lobbying from the American Library Association through various people who have led delegates that have
Exactly.
nonstop been petitioning these publishers to support libraries. All of them have finally come around, and it's been a long time in coming. But Simon and Schuster was the last holdout, and now they've committed to I think about 31 different libraries with
Mm-hmm.
3M and Overdrive now. One
And,
thing.
and I saw your article this week. They actually took it further. Not only will you read the book from the library, you can check it out. Then it turns around to where you can actually buy it through the library. That is so freaking brilliant. That is amazing.
Yeah,
Because what they've done is they've addressed the other buzzword from DBW, which was direct to consumer. So those people are going to sell that book through that library. The library can have affiliate status through a retailer. You get to buy a book you wanted while benefiting your public library, and at the same time, or you can buy it directly from Simon and Schuster and skirt the retailer altogether. Simon and Schuster is going to pocket that 30% distribution fee. That was brilliant. I wish more publishers would take a lesson and get on board with lending.
you think so?
I do. It
I
was absolutely brilliant.
Libraries
So
as retail mercy, I don't see it.
I
Libraries
know
are publicly funded. They're
they
meant to
are.
be a resource for all of the community. And most people who
Hmm.
use libraries, let's face it, their pockets aren't overflowing with cash,
Right.
which is
Right.
why they're getting the books for free. And if
Hmm.
you take a publicly funded, library, and then all of a
Hmm.
sudden you adopt the for-profit mentality,
Hmm.
I could see a firestorm erupting, not now, but in a few years from now, as libraries start saying, you know, we're selling like about 800 or 900 books a month.
Right.
We're making like $1,000+ Let's start promoting this, and then all of a sudden you're
Right.
seeing books for sale, but buy two get one free, and it's like
Yeah.
all of a sudden libraries are like less of a public, even though that they're being sustained by public funds.
Yeah.
They're going to embrace this for-profit mentality, and as a public library, I that scares me.
It does. I think what will make that okay is the fact that the library model has been in place for hundreds of years. We know how to run a public library. But at the same time, if you really dig deep, you'll see that public libraries have already been in the retail business in some way. You
Used book
can,
fairs and things
right,
like
that
that.
too. But like my local library, they rebuilt it. They built a brand new library for our town. It's beautiful. And there's meeting space that you have to pay to rent. I can still check out books for free, but if I want to have a meeting there, heck, I know somebody who had a baby shower there. You can go rent the
At the
space, and that,
library?
yeah, exactly,
That's
because it's a
actually
beautiful.
pretty awesome.
It is. I know. I'd love to have I want to get married again, just so I can get married at the
Totally.
library. Anyway,
Well, people renew their vows,
exactly.
right?
That's what we'll do. My husband will be very confused about why we're standing in the reference section. But anyway, but basically this is, and this is another topic that's really come up. There was a whole panel on the future of libraries at this year's event, and libraries are having to reinvent themselves to stay relevant. And this is brilliant that they can do this. They've made it optional. I can still borrow that ebook if I'm somebody who wants to get a free book and patronize my local library. Or if I know I wanted to purchase it, instead of closing the door behind me at that library and going to a bookstore or going online, I can know that I'm supporting my library by buying that book. I would love to see big signs outside. Hey, if you're going to buy a book, we'll help you out and you'll help us out. I would love to see that happen to help make sure that libraries keep those doors open. If I'm a consumer paying for a book, I would love to give that money to them so they can make it possible to keep their doors open and provide free content to people in my town who can't pay for it. I think it's genius. And
Yeah,
Simon and
see,
Schuster,
we totally
kudos to
differ.
them.
I hate it.
I know.
I
I
hate
know.
the fact that, like,
Yeah.
in order for a library to carry Penguin and Simon and Schuster
Hmm.
books, it's mandated that you have to sell them online. It's like
Okay.
libraries are being coerced.
Well,
It's like in order to carry, the latest Stephen King book, or,
mhm.
by famous authors, the types of authors that like sell a lot of books. It's like, we want to carry them, but that means we have to sell them too. I don't know if we want to open up this can of worms, but
Right.
it's not the fact that libraries could optionally make money. It's the fact that libraries are forced to sell ebooks in order to carry digital titles.
Well, no, they're forced to make it available. There's no quota, as far as I know, saying if you don't sell 15 copies of this per month, we're going to pull it off your shelves. So they're asked to make it available to keep this agreement, and of course they're also welcome to say no, we're not going to work with you. And then if that happens enough, Simon and Schuster will say maybe we should rethink this. I would far rather see an agreement like this in place than the current agreement, and I'm not faulting Random House. Random House charges a library 300% the retail price of the ebook
Yeah.
in order to know that they're going to make their money off of this, because they can't give them a $5.99 ebook and let them loan it to every patron under the sun and not get their money back. And believe it or not, I mean, it's easy to paint the publishers as the bad guys, and some of these news articles I read, yeah, I kind of wonder who made that decision in a board meeting. But they also have bills to pay, just like my library. So I would love to see more mutual agreements that can help the publishers keep their costs down to provide books, while helping a library keep their doors open.
Yeah.
And we have to look at the fact that, those libraries, you're right, they're publicly funded. That's money my town could have used for something else. And they're
Well,
giving it to a library. I'd love to see libraries get more sustainable.
one has to wonder how much the affiliate fee is. And
Yeah,
to be
that's true.
honest, like I've talked to, I've talked to people at Simon and Schuster, I've talked to people at 3M, Baker and Taylor, Overdrive, Penguin, and then I've even gone so far as to contact the head of circulations at like the New York Public Library,
Oh,
Queens Library, Brooklyn Library, where all these publishing companies, those were the first three libraries that they
yeah,
did pilot projects with. Nobody would tell me how much the affiliate fees are. And it's
right.
like, why do you keep these things such a secret, you know?
Yeah, and that's funny. The whole industry does. I mean, the entire industry, for whatever reason, does not want to talk figures and money. And I don't know why. I mean, there are companies who are going of complete transparency and full disclosure, and then there's others that want to keep it guarded like the Fort Knox gold, for some reason.
Yeah.
And I think it's more of a tradition. I think it's more of something that they've always done. They've always, and certainly someday years ago, it stemmed from some incident. I would hope that there was a logical reason why they do that, but they do. And that's probably just part of their agreements that you don't talk about this. One thing that might actually be taking place, I'm completely speculating here, is that the affiliate agreements are different for different libraries. So a library that has more patrons and sells more books might be making more money than a small town library that sells 2 books a month. And
Yeah.
truthfully, I have no problem with that. If you're out there promoting the books and your patrons are on board with supporting, sure, I'd love to see you get more of it than some library that just slaps it up on its website and doesn't really promote your brand.
Yeah, you would have to
So,
figure that the New York Public Library, which gets, they're big. They're like probably one of
right.
the biggest libraries like in the world in terms of user population, the amount of books, the amount of funding that they get. You would figure that they would probably get a sweeter deal.
Right, and that could be, and that could be levels, tiered levels, where it's based on patronage or something. I'm not in on the agreements there. I
Yeah.
could see those agreements in place, and I can agree with them. I would sleep at night fine with that. One of those things that we were just talking about was direct to consumer, and that came up a lot. Last year at DBW, we saw a lot of companies exhibiting who were working on getting publishers to create these branded dashboards, these websites where consumers would go buy their books directly from Penguin or Simon and Schuster or Red Adept Publishing, another small company I love. That didn't take off because, first of all, we're lucky these days if people actually walk into a bookstore and know the title and author. And I don't mean to imply that readers are stupid. I'm just saying, with so much content out there, we might hear about a book and go, oh, the one with the guy with the shoes on the cover, and then the bookstore staff has to help me find my book. You're not going to get them to go, oh, I need the latest book by Hugh Howey published by Simon and Schuster. That's too much to ask. And so consumers didn't jump on that. They did not decide, I'm going to go directly to every different publisher to buy my books. I like getting them from Amazon or Barnes & Noble or whomever, and going this one-stop shopping. So last year, with all the focus on publisher branded websites, that kind of fizzled, I think. This year, talking about direct to consumer, though, they were talking about doing it in different ways through things like social media traffic, incorporating these affiliate sales and things from other book discovery platforms and things like that. So kind of skirting the retailer in some way and rewarding the people who share news about the book, whether it's through a blog post, a platform, or something.
Book
So
reviews.
right, exactly. And so that will be very interesting to see if any of that actually takes off. Again, there was no targeted effort to say, don't sell your books through Amazon, let's sell them ourselves. But I think publishers are looking for a way to avoid Amazon and other retailers. And not saying, of course, we do get into the Amazon bashing at a lot of these events.
But they
I
want to
think
cut out the middleman.
they do, and that, first of all, that is smart business. So I can give them their understanding for that. I think they're also looking around and seeing bookstores closing, even in Barnes and Noble, closing bookstores and losing market share and things like that. And so it may not just be an attempt to avoid the bookstores. It may be an attempt to say, we better have another plan in place besides just relying on these people to sell our books on bookshelves.
Well, yeah, I
And
mean, the
so,
second
right,
largest bookstore in Germany just filed for insolvency, which is about the
right,
same thing as filing for bankruptcy. And,
right.
they employ 6,800 people. They have like over 100 locations, and it's gone.
Right.
that people just wouldn't, it had a complex ownership group mainly through the church. And
Right.
they were just disappointed that the bookstores put such an emphasis on 50 Shades of Grey and Sylvia Day books. And,
Right.
erotica and sex sells. I mean, we all
It
know
does.
that. But like
Right.
the church ownership group, it really splintered them because it's like, this is the best selling book of all time. But what is this book about? What's the morality behind this? And, that was one of the factors that decided them to pull the plug. So, I mean, if the second major bookstore in Germany could go under just like that, that does not bode well for like the book industry as a whole. If you look
Exactly.
at that as, sort of the second example of the Borders fiasco, where,
Hmm.
all of a sudden just this light switch gets turned off, 10,000 people are without a job, there's one big national chain is just gone and there's really no one to take their place. And that really hurts the overall publishing industry because it's one less sales outlet. And let's be honest, digital still does not account for very much of book sales.
Hmm.
Most publishers globally, like Penguin and Simon and Schuster, HarperCollins, they all say about 21 to about 24% of their global revenue stems from ebooks. But that's still a very large percentage of the traditional bookstore that they depend on to make sales. And if these bookstores are going under, that's got to hurt them. And they have to start thinking about these alternative models because what do you have left when almost everything else is closing or going out of business?
Exactly. And like I said, you're sticking your head in the sand if you don't have a plan in place to sell books in a way that does not involve here in America the number two bookstore chain. We could lose ours, if all the gloom and doom predictions are true. And so you have to have some backup plan to get those books in front of consumers.
Let's talk about Amazon bashing.
Okay. Sure.
We both go to a lot of these,
Yeah.
book and publishing conferences. Goody Reader is the normal sponsor of the IDPF at Book Expo America, which is one of the
Mhm.
largest digital publishing conferences. And I believe this year is going to be 2 days instead of just
It
one day.
is. Yeah, I mean, it's gotten that big that we have to devote an entire day, an additional day to it. So that'll be exciting.
It
I've always
is.
enjoyed the IDPF conference because, in the past at least, it has been very non platform. It's very much just the news and the data that we need to keep a digital publishing revolution going. And so I've always enjoyed that one. So I'm looking forward to having 2 days of information.
I agree. But if there's one sort of theme between all these conferences, whether it's Future Book in London or whether it's like the digital conference before the Frankfurt Book Fair, it seems as though you would it's always easy to find at least one or two sessions devoted to hating on Amazon.
Absolutely. And this year we had basically the whole morning on the second day of the conference devoted to these things. And truthfully, to be fair, I love Amazon. I'm a huge Amazon customer. But there were some eye-opening pieces of information.
Like what?
Some of the things, well, for example, the article we posted shortly after the conference about Amazon's move into academic publishing, not so much the publishing, but the academic book selling. And one of the things that came to light was that a lot of academic libraries are not aware that they think they're buying their books from Amazon. Amazon's turning around and buying them from Baker and Taylor. And so when the box with the smiley face shows up on the side, then the libraries are stating, well, we've stopped using Baker and Taylor. We're buying our books from Amazon now. Well, Amazon's buying the book too. And so basically, once the libraries get very comfortable thinking that Amazon is the person in charge of their book delivery, then that can actually hurt some of the companies that have been up until now providing this content to academic libraries. So like I said, a lot of interesting information in there. We did see a lot of discussion about how we don't want to go down that road again. There was a lot of talk. I love the presentation by Brad Stone, who was the author of The Everything Store.
That
He
was a
sat
great
down.
book.
It was. Well, he sat down with me and talked to me after his presentation about some of the practices that he saw taking place at Amazon. And so I particularly loved his anecdote about the cheetah and the gazelle. And so there was apparently a tongue in cheek remark. It was not meant to be taken seriously, according to some sources, that Jeff Bezos had said we need to go after the publishers like a cheetah goes after a sickly gazelle. And
Nice.
according to Stone, in fact, it became an inside joke within the company, and that they actually named their negotiations project when they were deciding how they were going to handle negotiations, the Gazelle Project.
That's
And
awesome.
then that Amazon's lawyers quickly shut that down and said, "You're not calling it that." Um, this is all great information in his book, The Everything Store. But he had a lot of eye-opening things to say, and he openly says, "I'm an Amazon customer. He calls himself a Bezosologist, so studying Jeff Bezos. He did call his one-star review from Mackenzie Bezos, Jeff's wife,
That was
the
actually hilarious that
I
like
know. He
um
called it the review heard round the world.
and I
So
think like almost every major news organization actually picked up. It
I
was one of
think
the
so.
few situations where a negative review actually made national headlines.
I know. Isn't that awesome? And he laughed it off. He was, he said, she's entitled to her opinion about it. But anyway, but he did a lot of talking about, how they've become the everything store, what they did. He did a lot of talk about horizontals and verticals, where they move into one line of traffic, for example, starting with books and then moving on to Kindles and then on to ebooks. But then they move horizontally into groceries and fashion and video. Now Amazon's producing its own content. So not just selling videos and streaming videos, they're producing content for video. And so he basically talks about how they spread up and sideways at the same time until they are larger than life. And basically said Amazon does not do anything small, and they do not do it without confidence. And so that's what makes them great. They don't sit back and wait to see what the rest of the industry is going to do with this before deciding to act. They take risks, and that's what's going to make them big. And they put that same focus that made them great in book selling in all the other aspects of their business. So there was a lot of talk about what would it take to compete with them. And one thing that Good e-reader has talked about a lot is, why are you competing? You can't. You cannot compete with these people, so stop trying. Do something different. I sat down in Frankfurt in October with one of the vice presidents from Barnes & Noble and said, all you have to do to compete is to get authors to pull their books out of KDP Select by putting their books in your physical stores. Indie authors cannot put their books easily in a physical bookstore. All you have to do is launch a program where we can, and they're going to pull those books out of KDP Select. They'll even pay you for the process. They haven't moved on that idea. So
Yeah.
Amazon jumps on things and tries new things. And unfortunately, other companies sit back and wait to see how the rest of the industry is going to respond first. And that's what makes them Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, they're the force to beat, but I think it's because they genuinely love books,
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to compete a company that like generally loves what they're doing. And,
Mm-hmm.
reading that book, it really makes it clear that like they've made their fortune selling books, and that's what they're all about. And I see a lot of dollar signs in people's eyes when they tell me about their new startup idea, and they're creating an ebook subscription service, or they're creating an ebook discovery site. It's just all about the dollar signs. It's not about like the love of reading. And you actually wrote a very interesting article about Pew Research and
Mm-hmm.
people's reading habits and trends. And from reading it, it really doesn't seem like a lot of people are even reading books these days.
I think we discovered that it said the average was 5 books per year, but that only 76% of American adults claim to have read a book this year, which I gotta say, I'm sorry, is higher than I would have guessed
Uh,
if you just asked me to pick a number. But yeah, it's not. Why isn't it 100?
yeah.
Of course, that was the people who did respond. That was a group of survey respondents, so it's not entirely a comprehensive picture. But it was very interesting that so many of them did not read more than one. So I would love to see a comparison to is that increased over previous years. I personally feel like there's so much more traffic and knowledge and awareness of books now, thanks to e-reading and to apps and such. And so I think more than since the digital revolution began, I think we're seeing an increase in general reading behavior, as opposed to before it was so easy to find and buy and read a book. So it'd be interesting to see more numbers on that.
Okay, so wrap up from DBW. We've talked about a lot of things, major trends. W- what's left? I mean, now that you've sort of come and gone from DBW, the landscape for conferences is pretty dry for the next little while. The ALA Midwinter Conference is at the end of the month, but
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't really seem like a lot of people are attending. It seems as though a lot of people are going to be going to the annual conference in Vegas and, Book Expo America in the summertime. Where do you think the publishing industry is going, like in the next 3 or 4 months?
Well, one of my favorite discussions from the entire DBW, the one that really made me sit up, take notice, and start writing stuff down, had to do with the authors themselves. So this whole conference talks about publishing and producing a book. There's typically not a lot of discussion of the authors themselves. And of course, very little aimed at self publishing because this is really an industry conference. This is really for the traditional industry. So I don't fault them for not having more self publishing news. But there was a study, Digital Book World Organization and Writer's Digest magazine polled 9,000 authors. And this was a very amazingly interesting study that they gave the results to. The full study is available from DBW, but they hit the highlights for us. First, they broke the authors into 4 categories: aspiring author, self published, traditionally published, and hybrid published. And so we had our 4 categories of authors there, and the news was amazing. We actually have an article posted on goodereader.com right now. So if anyone searches for it, it's actually called DBW Writer's Digest Survey on Author Satisfaction. And that right there was the first term that jumped out at me, was how happy are authors with the publishing industry. And it turns out the numbers are not exactly what you might think they were. First, 87% of self-published authors make less than $1,000 a year off the sales of their books, but 54% of traditionally published authors also make less than $1,000 a year. And that was a very interesting statistic. Less than a third of traditionally published authors said they were happy with their book cover. And so we're seeing a lot of authors saying, I don't like this lack of control. It was very interesting. One of the more interesting statistics was that authors who were self-published and traditionally published both tended to agree, majority agreed, that a self-published book and a traditionally published book were of the same quality, both in terms of print and the contents. And so right there, we've got traditionally published authors saying a self-published book is not worse than mine, and mine is not better than theirs. The really fun news from all of that was that buzzword hybrid author. The hybrid authors have seen both sides. They've seen the good, the bad, the ugly. They know what the publishing industry is like. They know what self-publishing is like. They make more money than either type of author. They spend more time per week writing. They have more books published by about 4 to 1. So they seem to be the happiest people of all. And it was actually speculated that it's possible they started with the traditional industry and said, I don't need this, and moved on into self-publishing and are actually happier with their results. And at one point, a speaker who followed up on that study said to the audience, what is that telling you in how you treat your authors? You, publishers, need to reevaluate your contracts with your authors. And she wasn't referring to the actual tangible money contract of the book. She meant your social contract. How are you treating these people? Are you using them up and spitting them out to get a best-selling book out of one of them? Or are you developing a lifelong relationship where your author feels valued and his content is actually put out there for people to enjoy for years to come?
Well,
And
that's kind of like a very naive way of looking at it. I mean,
was interesting.
if you're okay, so I look at it as like if I was an agent that,
Mm-hmm.
on a weekly basis, I'm maybe getting about 10 to 20 unsolicited manuscripts.
Oh, easily.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
we all know literary agents. They get as
Right.
much as they don't even want unsolicited stuff, they'll get it. And,
Yes.
they're weeding through all this stuff. And I could just see that a few years after doing that, you're just so jaded, you're just like, I've signed like, 10 of like 10,000, authors. None of them have like, sold more than 1,000 books. And it's just like, God, what do I got to do to get ahead, And I could
Right.
just see myself being pissed off because of my lack of success of an agent, their lack of success of like, of writing prowess. And, a lot of these contests make sense from that point of view. Remember, Wattpad and
Hmm.
National Novel Writing Month. A lot
Yeah,
of like the authors that actually won those or placed well actually got signed deals by like Harlequin and things like that, because
right.
it was almost like a crowdsourced effort, as in people all agreeing
Hmm.
that this book is good.
I will tell you one of the most shocking things I heard, and I've already said I love Dominique Rocca. She is a little spitfire, but she's not going to pull any punches. She knows her business. She knows her stuff. She educates herself. She happened, by the way, to mention, I think it was like 6 in the morning. She tweeted or retweeted an article we wrote about them, and I asked her that day. I was like, "What are you doing on Twitter, retweeting at 6 a.m.?" And she's like, "Well, I started reading at 4:30, and I came across your article at 6." I mean, she is
Nice.
right. She's absolutely knows her stuff. She's up on the stage with Tim O'Reilly and David Nussbaum and someone else. I'm sorry, Carolyn Reedy from Simon and Schuster.
Oh, a bunch of
And
nobodies, right?
oh, exactly, nobody's. Well, David Nussbaum made the point, and truthfully, you have to understand what F&W Media does. They have very niche markets for publishing. These are not mainstream trade fiction. They're not publishing the next Sylvia Day book, so they have very small markets. And he actually said, we don't work with authors who don't come to us with an established fan base. And like this, he meant like, an author presence or a social media following.
Right.
And she turned to him and said, then why do they need publishers? you know? And I thought, wow, I mean, she's going to say what she thinks, but it was very telling of the industry. We're seeing publishers and agents now going to places like Wattpad and looking on social media and stuff and seeing which authors already have a fan base because it's getting so difficult to sign a debut author and make that person into a bestseller.
Totally.
And I remember Hugh Howey told me this back last year at Book Expo. He said, when people started shopping around trying to get him to sell them the rights to Wool, this book that was doing phenomenally well, 50,000 a month, at one point for the Wool saga, when it was just a self-published ebook. And he said, I think it was to Random House, maybe. He said, how much are you going to pay me to tell people you published my book?
Yeah.
And that was chilling. I mean, it's like, I don't need you. If you're going to bring me an offer, it better be good.
And that
And
makes sense because I actually read an article from like a startup incubator, and they
mhm,
actually said that 10 million users is the new 1 million users. Like if
right,
you don't have a product that doesn't have at least 10 million people using it, we're not going to look at you. Whereas like 2 years ago it was like 1 million, it was good.
yeah,
Now, 10 million is the new 1 million, and it's the same with like authors where there's just so much stuff out there that
right.
how do you weed through the good from the bad? It's almost like impossible even for an entire team of people writing manuscripts, that you're better off just like gaining intelligence on like, what self-published authors have these large followings and aren't actually signed. Let's just go target them. I mean, to me that's good business, it's
It is right. You're looking at far less investment. You're looking at people who bring an established fan base, but in some ways you're going to have to sweeten the pot because if they've already got their 10 million followers, why do they need you? Like Dominique said, we wrote yesterday about Sylvia Day's latest multi-million-dollar book deal.
must
She
be
has had
nice.
right. She's had several. Again, somebody we've never heard of. She's had several of these deals, and I was discussing it with an author. It's not that she's shopping around to publishers to get more money. She's got the clout behind it. She
Yeah.
could take your zeros and dollar signs or leave it. She's got her money. Now she has the power to say, oh no, sir, this is a 4 book deal. This is the cover I want. This is how you're going to market it. She's able to do that. And I think that's what authors have been missing. She doesn't need your money. She can do that on her own. She
And
has her
she's not money
fans.
hungry either. I
No,
actually met her and chilled
right.
out with her for about an hour at BA last year. And
Hmm.
like she was surprisingly grounded,
Yeah.
just like she's married, she has like a few kids, like she doesn't even, she has a home office. It's like it's just like she's surprisingly grounded as like an
Absolutely.
author
Not a
who makes.
diva.
Yeah, oh,
right.
totally. And I've met a lot of author
Right.
divas, and
Oh,
you were
yeah.
telling me before the show start that like you met like some diva like publishers even at the event.
Absolutely. The ones who are too good to talk to you because we're so and so. And then you're going to see which publishers have some great sales, which have a huge author following and reader following. And it's the ones who are actually out there, like I said, on Twitter at 4:30 in the morning reading headlines, reading articles from news sites to see what people are saying about the industry. Those are the people who are successful because
Sounds
they're
like me.
actually right, they're actually listening to their readers, not just their authors, not just the industry speculation about what's supposed to be big, not just reading articles that vampires are out. They're actually
Or Bigfoot
online.
erotica.
Exactly. That's my favorite. Bigfoot
That's in
erotica.
right now.
I love it.
Gargoyles, Bigfoot, or Big
Absolutely.
Feet, and
Yes.
so like vampire and werewolf romances. That's so like 2011, 2012.
Hmm.
It's all about just like alien, like alien romances, erotica, just like all this like weird stuff. Like it's
Right.
basically cartoons you watched as a kid, but just like
Exactly.
make it erotic, and it's all good.
But I gotta say, I'm gonna love me a vampire for a second because I fully believe self-publishing would not have taken off like it did as quickly if it were not for those vampires. Here's why. Because once the vampires kind of came and went, the fans were not done with it, and neither were the authors. And so when those authors were out there publishing and pushing their own content to those fans, flying under the radar because the industry was done with them, that's what really got people to say, you know what? I don't care who published this book. I like it. I'm going to buy it. I'm going to pay for it. And so those authors were out there doing that legwork and the fans were supporting them. So basically, the readers are tired of being told what the hot new thing is.
Yeah.
I'll decide what I like to read. So I got to say, I love me a vampire too, because they turned this industry on its head. The authors and the fans got tired of being told, I'm done with vampires.
Well, okay, so I was gonna wrap up the show, but I think like this is actually kind of interesting because it seems as though like our vampires got really big about at the same time as like the Twilight movies came
Yeah.
out, and
Oh,
like
absolutely.
it had been actually some years before Anne Rice, she stopped writing about vampires. Vampires have always been that type of thing where it's like it's always in cinema, always in movies, but you don't really read good vampire books, and it's like vampires are like they have that inherent sex charm. It's
Hmm.
like the intimacy of like sucking someone's blood or making them your thrall, and so on. So I could really see why that caught on. And then, the whole like werewolf vampire thing, well, that just makes sense because, even if you looked at like old silent cinema or like whatever with like Bela Lugosi,
Hmm.
and like the swamp thing and like the werewolf, I mean, that was old stuff. I mean, you look at how cinema became popular. I think it became popular because of all those monsters. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
And like,
Right.
self-publishing got popular for the exact same thing. Like, 80, 90 years later, it's the same thing. It's like full circle where like vampires and like werewolves and monsters really kind of like put self-publishing on the map with like people like, Maya Banks and like Sylvia Day and
Oh, yeah. Amanda
people.
Hawking, absolutely.
Yeah. And
People like that.
so it's just very interesting, and it's only a matter of time before, okay, maybe that stuff's a little stale. What's next? What else could we write about? And just taking all these like mythological things and just writing erotica tales about them.
Right. And I'll tell you one of the funnier things, and I hate to sound like I'm disparaging it, but it's funny to me, is the good old fashioned cowboy romance is still alive and well. Those are being written left and right and selling. I mean, because romance fans like them. So basically, like I'm saying, I mean, just because the industry has decided we have a hot new topic does not mean the fans got tired of it. And so I really got to think that the fans actually helped push self publishing even faster than it would have naturally evolved because they were tired of being told, that's not what we're selling this month. And so they've turned back to those same people who were writing the books that they loved before, and they're following right in line with what those people are still enjoying to write,
That
and
actually
the new
sounds
people
like a
enjoy to
good
reading.
article for the site you should write
It
about,
does.
self-publishing being accelerated due to like, werewolves and vampires.
Right, absolutely. So same old bloodsuckers are sparking the digital revolution. And I know we
Totally.
have to wrap up soon, but I was going to say that was one of the more interesting comments I heard a lot from the CEOs, at least, was that we are just beginning the digital revolution. We are not in the middle of it. It's not fading. Ebook sales are not stagnating, and we are only just beginning to see what's going to be possible with ebooks. That was another major comment made at Digital Book World this year. And I want to see where it's going to go. Vampires and all.
All right, we were joined today by Mercy Pilkington, staff writer and senior editor of GoodyReader.com. My name is Michael. If you like the show, drop a comment. If you're listening to the show on iTunes, YouTube, or various other channels, check it out at GoodyReader.com. And Mercy, thanks for attending the show and doing DBW and joining us today.
Thanks so much. It's fun to be here.
All right, talk to you all after a while.